Hello, welcome to Unit 4 of our course. Unit 4 will begin on Sunday, November 16th and end on Saturday, November 22nd at 11:59 p.m. I look forward to working with you during this unit. In this unit, we will be exploring the major events in American history in the 1960s. Among the topics that we will be examining is the Vietnam War, one of the most controversial conflicts in American history, and the hippie counterculture of the 1960s. We will also explore revisions to America's immigration law, which have greatly impacted the United States in American history. I would like to briefly comment upon each of the assignments for this unit. During this unit, you will be asked to participate in one discussion board, you will be asked to complete a film commentary, and you will be asked to answer questions related to an assigned feature essay. The discussion board for this week relates to the origins of the Vietnam War. In other words, the beginnings, what led up to the conflict in Vietnam. This is a rather complex topic, but I think a very interesting and fascinating topic. Many do not realize that America's involvement in Vietnam was part of a much longer conflict. Vietnam was colonized by France in the late 19th century, in the 1880s. Vietnam was part of a French colony referred to as Indochina, essentially meaning to the south of China. And from the very beginning, there was a mixed reaction in Vietnam to France's presence. A minority of the population in Vietnam benefited from French colonialism. Some Vietnamese merchants, businessmen, political leaders, and wealthy landowners profited from French rule. So there were people in Vietnam who supported the French. A majority of the population in Vietnam was very much opposed to French colonial rule. Generally, there was greater support for French rule in large urban areas, and much less support for French rule in rural areas where there was a predominantly peasant population. From the 1880s up to 1940, France ruled Vietnam and had to deal with significant opposition. The opposition to French rule in Vietnam greatly intensified in the early 1920s. This opposition was led by a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese man. He traveled to Europe in order to advance his education. And in 1919, Ho Chi Minh traveled to the Peace Conference at Versailles. This was a conference that was designed to basically resolve the issues caused by the First World War, to bring a definitive end to the First World War. At the conference at Versailles, a young man named Ho Chi Minh, who had no political office, spoke on behalf of the Vietnamese people, he claimed, and requested that the people of Vietnam be granted independence from French rule. No one listened to his plea. His demand for independence was ignored. Subsequently, Ho Chi Minh traveled to the Soviet Union, or Soviet Russia, as it was called at this time, and received training in communism, or an education in communism, as well as basically revolutionary activities. Ho Chi Minh then, in the early 1920s, returned to Vietnam and helped to organize and found the Vietnamese Communist Party, and proceeded to organize a guerrilla war against French colonial rule. So from the early 1920s up to 1940, there was a conflict in Vietnam between Vietnamese rebels and the French military. France sought to maintain control of its colony, whereas the Vietnamese Communists' goal was to basically drive the French out of this colony and secure Vietnamese independence. Clearly, this was a colonial conflict. Overall, the French were successful in retaining control of their colony during this period, but increasingly the Vietnamese Communists inflicted significant losses on French forces. In the early 1940s, the situation in Vietnam changed radically. The Empire of Japan took over Indochina, which included Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and essentially replaced the French as the rulers of Vietnam from 1941 to 1945. Unfortunately, and tragically, the Japanese ruled Vietnam very brutally. They treated the civilian population of Vietnam as subhumans, essentially, killing large numbers of civilians. Not surprisingly, the Vietnamese Communists shifted their attention to fighting against the Japanese Empire and seeking independence from Japan. During this period, interestingly, the United States formed a tacit alliance with Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Communists, providing them with arms and support, since we had a common enemy, the Empire of Japan. In 1945, the Empire of Japan was defeated at the end of World War II, and Ho Chi Minh at this point issued a Declaration of Independence for the people of Vietnam, basically declaring that Vietnam would now be an independent state. The French government, though, was very interested in regaining control of its colony in Vietnam and more broadly in Indochina. The French had been humiliated to a great extent during World War II by their defeat by Nazi Germany. The French government was concerned that the Anglo-American alliance would become the dominant Western power and that France would basically no longer be regarded as a great world power. The French government, led by Charles de Gaulle, decided that the best way to assert their power in the post-war world would be to reclaim control of their colonial empire, including French Indochina, as well as French Algeria, both of which led to significant conflicts. So French military forces streamed back into Vietnam and Indochina in the post-war period in 1945, 1946, 1947, and onward, provoking a new conflict. From 1945 to 1954, the French government fought a protracted war in Vietnam. They faced growing resistance from the Vietnamese Communists. During this war, the French were able to retain control of the large urban areas, but had great difficulty retaining control of the rural countryside. The French established greater control over the southern part of Vietnam than they were able to over the northern portion of Vietnam, which became a stronghold for the Vietnamese Communists led by Ho Chi Minh. The United States government found itself in an interesting position during this conflict. Generally, the United States was urging European countries to grant independence to their former colonial empires in the post-war period. For example, the United States pressured the Dutch to surrender control of the Dutch East Indies, which would become the independent nation of Indonesia. The United States also urged the British to give up control of their vast colony on the subcontinent of India, which became the nations of India and Pakistan. France, though, the French government, was insistent that they be permitted to reassert control over French Indochina. And furthermore, the French government asserted that they would not cooperate in the Cold War with the United States if the United States did not support their effort to regain control of French Indochina. So essentially, Charles de Gaulle and the French government said, if you, the United States, want us to support NATO and to support American efforts in the Cold War, if you want France to be a willing partner in the Cold War struggle against Soviet communism, then you, the United States, must provide support for our effort to regain control of our colony in Indochina, Vietnam. The United States government ultimately decided to support the French for a variety of reasons. One, to maintain an alliance and to cement an alliance with France, still a very important country in Western Europe, economically and militarily. And secondly, because Ho Chi Minh was the leader of a communist party, and the United States, under the Truman Doctrine, had committed to struggling against the spread of communism all across the world. So the United States poured huge amounts of money and weapons into the French war in Indochina. During this period, there were no American forces fighting. The French were fighting. But the United States was providing 80% of the money needed to support the war effort. So we're obviously major players in the war. This was not a secret. Meanwhile, Communist China and the Soviet Union were providing money and aids to Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists. This was becoming an international struggle in many ways. Ultimately, by 1954, the French public had grown increasingly frustrated and outraged by the war. There were massive protests in France, which threatened to topple the French government, anti-war protests. The French casualty rate was increasing greatly, and the French lost a rather decisive battle known as Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The French government decided to cut their losses in 1954 and to negotiate an exit from Vietnam. This became the Geneva Conference and the Geneva Accords, or Agreement. France agreed that by 1956 they would withdraw all French military forces from Vietnam. For a period of 2 years, from 1954 to 1956, Vietnam was to be divided in two. The northern part of Vietnam would be administered by Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists. In the southern part of Vietnam, France would establish an independent Vietnamese government. Then, in 1956, all French forces were to be evacuated from Vietnam, and a national election was supposed to be held to reunify the country as an independent nation. This was the plan under the Geneva Accords. Interestingly, though, the United States was not a signatory to the Geneva Accords. France agreed to this proposal, but the United States, interestingly, did not, which was a harbinger of things to come. So the French established a quasi-independent government in South Vietnam under a man by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was Vietnamese. He was from a wealthy family in South Vietnam. He was a Roman Catholic and had been educated in essentially French schools and had supported French colonialism, essentially. So Ngo Dinh Diem, many people in Vietnam viewed as a sort of puppet of France. Even though he was Vietnamese, he was associated with the legacy of French colonial rule in many ways. Now, as France withdrew from South Vietnam, the United States government became increasingly involved in South Vietnam. During the administration of President Dwight Eisenhower, the United States began to replace France as the dominant influence in South Vietnam, providing large amounts of weaponry and money to the government of Ngo Dinh Diem. So increasingly, the United States became the primary sponsor of the government of South Vietnam. So 1956 came around, and it became clear that there would be no elections to reunify Vietnam. It would be very difficult to have any sort of free elections. One difficulty is that Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Communists had established a rather brutal dictatorship in North Vietnam. Anyone who did not support the Communist Party in North Vietnam was likely to be imprisoned or killed. The possibility of having a free and fair election in North Vietnam was basically impossible. Likewise, in the south, Ngo Dinh Diem had established an undemocratic dictatorship, essentially, in South Vietnam as well, and the chances of having any kind of free election in the south were also very dim. Ultimately, the elections were called off. No national elections would be held in 1956. And at this point, a civil war erupted in South Vietnam. Many people in South Vietnam opposed the government of Ngo Dinh Diem, viewing him as a puppet of the United States and Western imperialism. And also, there was opposition to Ngo Dinh Diem because he was trying to suppress Buddhism and to enforce Roman Catholicism in South Vietnam. And also, Ngo Dinh Diem's government was notoriously corrupt. So there were a number of communist rebels trying to topple the government of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. And of course, the North Vietnamese communists were providing arms and support to the communists within South Vietnam. Meanwhile, the United States government began to send military advisors into South Vietnam and provided Ngo Dinh Diem's government with significant weaponry and money. And this began to draw America into the conflict in Vietnam. By the time the United States sent large-scale ground forces into Vietnam in 1965, the conflict in Vietnam was already decades old. Ho Chi Minh had been leading communist forces in conflict in Vietnam since the early 1920s. This is 1965, over 40 years later. The conflict in Vietnam would not be resolved ultimately until 1975, over 50 years after it first began. Ho Chi Minh would die in 1968. He would not live to see the end of the conflict. But ultimately, his goal of an independent, communist-led Vietnam would be established. The United States' role in Vietnam would be one of the most controversial wars in American history, and certainly a very costly conflict for the United States. So that's a bit about the origins of the Vietnam War. As you can see, it is quite complex in a variety of levels. Now, the film that you're viewing for this week, Summer of Love, deals with another major aspect of the 1960s, the hippie counterculture. In the 1960s, San Francisco, and particularly the Haight-Ashbury district, a working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, became a hotbed for the hippie counterculture. A massive rebellion against the cultural norms of the 1950s, which involved aspects such as experimentation with drugs, the embrace of different clothing and styles, experimentation with more openness in regards to sexuality, and also oftentimes an exploration of Eastern religious faiths and traditions. During the Summer of Love, hippies within San Francisco invited hippies from all across America to come to San Francisco to celebrate a summer of love. And tens of thousands of hippies, mostly young people, descended on San Francisco. This caused tremendous strain on the community, and the film Summer of Love deals with this era when huge numbers of people supporting the hippie counterculture moved to San Francisco in an effort to try to create a more perfect world or more perfect community, and addresses the results and impact of this. I think you'll find it to be an interesting and engaging film, and I look forward to hearing your comments on it. Finally, The focus essay for this week deals with the reform of immigration law. From 1924 to 1965, U.S. immigration law was shaped by the National Origins Act. The National Origins Act restricted immigration on the basis of ethnicity and race. Great limitations were placed on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and from any part of Asia. Basically, it was very difficult from 1924 to 1965 for people from Southern or Eastern Europe or from Asia to migrate to the United States. And this immigration law was fairly clearly shaped by racism, by ethnocentrism, by hostility to people from certain parts of the world. In 1965, massive immigration reform was passed during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, what's popularly known as the Immigration Act of 1965. With this act, the national origin system was discarded, and a new system was established that was based largely on quotas for family reunification. Basically, the new immigration system would give preference to immigrants who already had family in the United States, which led to chain migration to the United States. Once one family member established legal residency in the United States, it became possible for other family members to immigrate into the United States. This greatly transformed the nature of immigration to the United States. The number of immigrants entering the United States would increase dramatically, and more immigrants would enter the United States from Asia and from Latin America in particular. So there'd be a shifting ethnic and racial composition to immigration into the United States, which led to increasing diversity within the United States, which has continued up to the present day. So I hope that you will find the discussion board, the film, and the focus essay to be interesting, and I look forward to working with you this week. Thank you.